Let's see if I can make it work now. This is the vagaries of Zoom. Okay, share screen and bonk. Okay, so here we are. So this is from the Talmud, and this is a story about the way the law is interpreted, not the law itself. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Abba said in the name of Shmuel. So the person reporting is the second generation of the rabbis of the Talmud that come after the Mishnah. So we're talking, it would seem, the middle of the 3rd century. But they're talking about things that happened in the 1st century of the Common Era. Shalosh shanim nechlaku Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued. They were divided over many, many areas of Jewish laws, you can see in the Mishnah, for 3 years. Now, what does it mean for 3 years, they argued? It means to say that after the destruction of the temple, and after in 68 of the Common Era, and after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai convinced the Romans at that time to allow Yavne and its sages to be spared, and after the destruction and the war, probably 5 to 10 years later, they all gathered together in Yavne, which was where the place of the academy. It's the place where the Sanhedrin went to, though it no longer had the status. In other words, for the Sanhedrin to have its full power of deciding law, and it needs to be in its place in the temple. So the members of the Sanhedrin were there, those who survived, but the siege of Jerusalem, but they were not functioning as a Sanhedrin anymore, but rather it was a conclave of all the rabbis, all the people who were considered part of the academy. And I don't mean as a school, but the Academy of Sciences, that sort of thing. So this academy gathered together, and for 3 years they debated the laws. And most of those debates were the debates that we find in the Mishnah between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. So for 3 years they argued. Halalu omrim, halacha kamotenu. These said the halacha is like us and brought proofs. Halalu omrim, and the other group said the law is like us. So Yotza bat kol v'omro, a divine voice came out and said, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim hein. Both these and those are the words of the living God. V'halacha kebeit Hillel, but the law is like Beit Hillel. Now, we know from elsewhere in the Talmud that we don't make rulings from heavenly voices, from prophetic voices. But the concept is that we know from elsewhere in the Talmud that they voted to follow Beit Hillel except in 18 cases. There are several dozen arguments, except in 18 cases. And the idea of this heavenly voice is that the sense that as if it were the Almighty concurred with the decision of the sages. Now, the concept over here of these and these are the words of the living God. It means to say that that God gave us a set of tools to interpret the Torah with. That's the oral tradition. And anyone who used those tools properly without bias is uncovering something that God packed into the Torah. And God can bear contradictions, and there are many possible paths baked potentially in the Torah. But when it comes to life, in other words, God exists beyond time and space. So in the mind of God, you can have two contradictory rulings. But in this world, we can't. We have to follow halakha, a path, because you can only do one thing at one time. We're in time and space. And that's the purpose of Torah, to sanctify time and space. Therefore, we have to choose one. So, but the idea is, and this is very important, that when we have different opinions within the framework of the classical understanding of the Torah, within the framework of Judaism, so within that framework, we often have divergent opinions, and we should understand that it's not that there's one opinion that's legitimate, one opinion that's not legitimate. They're all legitimate because any understanding of the Torah arrived at by honest analysis is legitimate and represents an idea as if it were that exists in the mind of God. But when it comes to practicality, we have to choose, and we choose by majority.
Majority.
By what?
Majority.
Majority, yes, the majority of the sages at the time. Now, if you're wondering, I often get questions, what about nowadays? The last time we had a gathering of all the rabbis, all the people who were that it was universally accepted that these represent the communities of the Jewish people, was at the closing of the Babylonian Talmud, about the year between 475 and 525. Since then, we haven't had a gathering in which we agree who should be in the gathering, and that encompasses everyone. Today, with technology, we could do it, but we're not going to get agreement as who should be in the gathering. So now we have different opinions in different communities, and that's fine. I guess we'll have to wait for the restoration of the Sanhedrin to solve arguments.
Rabbi?
At this time, these arguments were solved.
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead.
How about the 16th century in Sfat?
The attempt to revive the Sanhedrin?
No, a gathering of...
There were many great rabbis, including the authors of the Code of Jewish Law. But you had rabbis in Morocco and in Egypt and in Poland and in Bohemia and in Germany and in Tunisia and Italy, all great rabbis who weren't included in that group. So they were a very great group, probably the greatest gathering, until this day in Israel of great sages. But nevertheless, they did not represent even a plurality of the people who were out there. Though most Sephardic Jews accepted upon themselves to follow Rabbi Yosef Karo's rulings, who did live in Sfat at the time. But that doesn't, that again, that's about, a third of the world Jewish community. And even there are variations. But it's okay, again, since we don't have a method of deciding, it's okay to say these and these are the words of the living God. It's all cool. Now, since both these and these are the words of the living God, what merit did Beit Hillel have that the halacha should be established like them? If you analyze their positions and you go back to the Torah, both of them have very legitimate approaches. In every argument, Shammai and Beit Hillel, there is logic on the side of both of them. So why in the end did the majority vote like Beit Hillel? More importantly, because the heavenly voice indicates that there's sort of a divine providence. God doesn't have any power to rule once he gave us the Torah. That's up to us. But the heavenly voice indicates acquiescence. So we're asking a meta question. Why in the grand sweep of spiritual history does Beis Hillel win? The answer is because they were agreeable and tolerant. Vishonim divrayim, they always taught their words and the words of Beit Shammai. But not only that, they prioritized the statements of Beit Shammai to their words. Hillel, we learned a long piece about Hillel's patience in Tractate Shabbat a while ago. Hillel's students followed him. They were very, very patient, very, very open. And here's the thing. Because they were easygoing, and not only that, what does it mean they put Beis Shammai's words before their own? It means to say that when they taught, they seriously considered Beis Shammai's words and their arguments. And only after seriously considering them did they disagree. They understood their opponent's position, they understood why they were saying what they're saying, and then they respectfully disagreed. In other words, Beit Hillel absorbed the teachings of Beit Shammai, studied them, took them seriously, and therefore when they argued, it came from a thorough understanding of both sides. And also they did not take it personally. They did not take personally this debate.
Is that to suggest then that the followers of Beit Shammai did not do the same thing when they were considering the other side's opinion?
So Shammai was a tougher fellow, as we saw earlier, and what should we call it? Beit Shammai, they tended to be focused on their opinion and their understanding. I'm sure, again, we see in other places that it was respectful. But I think the concept is that the Beit Hillel took into account Beit Shammai's positions more thoroughly than the other way around. And therefore, in other words, there are thousands of areas they don't disagree. And it's entirely conceivable that many of those areas of halacha were taught by Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel accepted it. So yes, they only argued where they thoroughly understood the opponent's position. And Beit Shammai was, I think, more parochial. They were more focused on their own tradition and their own position. And that's a reflective, in other words, who became a student of Shammai and who became the student of Hillel. So the students of Shammai were very bright, but very rigorous and very, very focused on the matter at hand. And on their tradition and their position. Hillel by nature was a more open person. And also another distinction is that Hillel saw more leniencies. In other words, where we're interpreting a law and there exists a very narrow interpretation, a broader interpretation that's more lenient, that's easier to follow, with very few exceptions. Beit Hillel usually takes a more lenient approach to the law, a less demanding approach. In other words, Beit Shammai tended to ask what is the ultimate truth, what is the best and therefore most thorough and narrow way to understand the law. Beit Hillel asked the question, what is the broadest understanding with the least stringency that we can extract from the law? And so Beit Shammai by nature was very focused on the ideal. Beit Hillel was very focused on, shall we say, the reality of the law. In other words, what does the law bear and what human limitations does it take into account? So by nature, Beit Hillel was more open both to the real world possibilities that have to be fed into the law and to possible different ways other than their own. Beit Shammai had this laser focus on not just their understanding of the truth, but the ideal understanding of the law, somewhat divorced from the question of how do we, are there more lenient or other interpretations? So, and this is why there's another piece of Talmud that says in the Messianic era, when everything will be perfect and there'll be no limitations, shall we say, to people's ability to follow the law, that the law will revert to Beit Shammai. But in an imperfect world, Beit Hillel is more functional.
Question, Rabbi?
Yes.
I was wondering if the students and their houses of learning were in the same cities.
They were in the same places. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is a conceptual house. They literally studied in the one of the examples, Keren B'Yavne, the vineyard of Yavne, which was wasn't a vineyard, but it was an outdoor space, like an amphitheater, where the sages sat in rows and rows like a vineyard. No, they sat together, they studied together. The Talmud says they didn't stop. They did not avoid marrying each other's families and eating together. In other words, if there was something Beit Shammai said wasn't acceptable to eat, and Beit Hillel did, they didn't form each other. So the point is, though, they lived in friendship and love and affection and married into each other's families and shared Shabbat dinners and so on. They were in the same place. The house is purely conceptual.
Thank you.
And that's important. In other words, we hold up Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel as examples of the fact that very intense debate does not necessarily bring to intense dislike. And at the risk of editorializing, that might be a lesson that our society, both in the Holy Land and in the United States, could learn from. That just because you disagree very profoundly on ideas is not a reason to dislike or be mean to each other. Okay. If you genuinely care about the idea, So you care about the idea because you care about everyone in your society. So whether it's a synagogue or a city or a whole country, we need to remember this, that if you care about the truth, you might argue vigorously, but your affection for your fellow is not taken away. And that's something that the modern world has to a great extent forgotten. And that's why we learn these things, to understand, among other things, to understand the values which are eternal within Judaism.
Rabbi,
Yes.
why do you think it's been forgotten in the Holy Land, in Eretz Israel?
Quite simply, I think that we are not immune of the influence of the world as a whole, and I think that we have a long tradition in society and politics of a very bitter of us versus themism. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai teach us the way Jews should live is my idea versus your idea. Let's discuss. Let's argue. Historically, even in the Holy Land, Jews tend to argue and say tough things, but they, with rare exceptions, they very rarely lift a hand to each other. And to the extent that that happens, that's moving away from this basic Jewish idea that everyone needs to understand the Torah as they best can, and obviously to state a public position, one has to be qualified. But on the whole, everyone needs to understand the Torah as they can. Everyone needs to vigorously defend what they understand to be the truth of the Torah. And absolutely, if you have a different view than someone else, try to convince them. But in the end, this is a process that comes out of a love for the truth and a love for each other. And there are many examples of this in the Talmud, and even examples where this failed and bad things happen. So this concept is very, very important, because if you are interested in the truth, it's because you want to share that truth with everyone, but you also understand that someone else might see things differently, and you have to find a way to maintain the civil and positive relationship, notwithstanding the intensity of the disagreement. Why? Because ultimately, if these and these are the words of the living God, if you have two different gods, well, then you have an insoluble problem. But if there's one God and one Torah, then you have to find a way to maintain that unity, while at the same time doing your best to understand your particular kaleidoscopic section. The Torah is like a kaleidoscope, and there's a particular view, a particular pattern that appeals to you. So learn it, share it, argue about it, but ultimately you're one people sharing one Torah and one God, and that can't be forgotten.
Rabbi?
Yes.
The concept negotiating to yes.
Yes, the very famous book, and that's certainly reflected in the way that the sages argue with each other.
Especially Beit Hillel.
Yeah. Now, Lalamdacha, what does this teach us? That the law was like Beit Hillel. Shekol hamash belatzma, whoever lowers themselves, which means to say, takes in the possibility that I may be wrong, and listens openly and honestly to differing opinions. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Magbiyo, God lifts them up. V'chol Magbiya atzmo, and whoever lifts themselves up, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mashpilo, where a person is very sure of themselves, and I know I'm right just because I'm so bright and so on, so God lowers this person. Providence does not favor the person who's too sure of themselves. Kol ha'machazer ala gedula, whoever seeks greatness, and this is also a problem. In other words, look at Moses, we just read about in the Torah portion, right? Moses runs away, he doesn't want to be the leader. Unfortunately, in modern politics, it's the other way around. So whoever seeks greatness, greatness runs away from them. Whoever runs away from greatness, gedula machzeres acharav, greatness follows them. This is whoever tries to force the moment pushes them away. And whoever allows the moment to push them away, then the moment stands for them. What it means to say is that someone might want something very much, but you see it's not going, it's not happening. You know, like sometimes someone wants a deal to happen in business, and when it doesn't happen, they resort to dishonest and illegal means to make it happen. The sense that I want this now is very morally dangerous. And the sense where I see something's not going and it can't be done ethically and properly, I let go and say, well, God will give me another opportunity. So then shall meditlo, then the time will come. But anytime you get so caught up in, I want this to happen now, and you're willing to cut moral and ethical and spiritual corners to do that, that's where all the trouble begins. And by the same token, if you're meant to lead, leadership will come to you, where you pursue it and ultimately take harsh and wrong measures to do it, it's going to run away from you. And this is the, in other words, Judaism understands that someone might recognize that they have the potential to lead. So make yourself available, it will come. Judaism understands that there are visions we have, whether social, financial, political, whatever. You do everything you can do in an honest way that is true to the ethics and values of the Torah. But don't push it, because when you push it, you walk off a moral precipice. And this little piece of Aggadot, if one looks around themselves, and without, and this isn't, a statement of any particular group in politics society, but on the whole, if you look around the world, you will see that the failure to follow this brings a great deal of trouble, and those who follow this do well. And the premise is that if God means you to be elevated to greatness, you will be, to leadership. And if God means your endeavor to succeed, it will, without having to lie, without having to behave in a way that is different from the value system that the Torah asks of us. And I would suggest that this value system is pretty universal. In other words, it's not merely for Jews from the Torah, but is really encompassed. Most of the values we discuss here in the Aggadot are relevant to all human beings in all places and all times. Anyway, so that brings us to and that's the greatness of the Talmud, by the way. Rabbi Steinsaltz, bless him, used to mention this, that many of the issues the Talmud addresses are fundamental to the human condition and teach us something about the human condition in all places and all times. So with that, we will wish everyone a good day. You are all invited back for our quick 15-minute Parsha. And thank you all for joining.
Good day, good Chodesh.
Chodesh
Thank you, Rav.
Chodesh Tov, everyone. Take care. All the best.